with me. Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for our speaker. We thank you for each and everyone that has made time to come today. Lord, we ask for your blessing upon us, that you would guide us and direct us in your ways. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Let's honor the flags, starting with the American.
Of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Let's try the Texas flag. It's a little more challenging. Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance
To the Texas, one state, under God, one and indivisible.
I don't know why this one is so difficult. I was cheating. All right, this is a time where we usually go around the room and introduce us, who we are and the organizations we represent. But in the interest of our speakers' time, and this is a super program, really. So I want to move it right to you, Brad Phillips, and arborist, and deals with a lot of nature disasters, floods, forest fires, and it's really a different approach for us. It's not ambulances and stuff. Anyway, Brad, thank you.
All right. Okay. I don't know any of you other than Philippe and Lynn. So I'm actually was hoping that you guys might each introduce yourself for a brief few moments and just go ahead and just let me know who you are, what you do here at CRTF, or what you bring to wait, that's here. CRTF? Okay, all right.
I'll be right back.
If you wouldn't mind, we'll just start right here and then we'll work our way to the front.
I'm sorry.
No, you're good. I'm gonna make my name details up here while you guys are doing that so I can hear you.
Yeah, I'm Cameron Chopper. I'm with Congressman Dan Crenshaw's office.
Thank you.
I'm Caxie Son. I'm with the Rotary Club of Lake Houston area and I'm a Boy Scout leader.
Excellent. The back row.
I'm Larry Lane. I'm with the TIAC Amateur Radio Club, an occasional attendee here.
All right.
Patrick Snyder. I'm the Jamboree on the Air coordinator for the Boy Scouts and the San Houston Area Council, and also active and supporter of the CRTF and the CERT, the Community Emergency Response Teams.
Excellent. Front row over here. Lynn, I know you. Earl Finley, CRTF. All right. What you have, what brings you to CRTF, Earl? What skill sets are you here for? What are you contributing? What are you contributing from your regular life to CRTF? Communication. Communications, all right.
Paul Robertson, CRTF. I believe you visited our Trails Association recently.
Very possibly.
Yeah, I think so. Woodland Hills Trails.
Yes,
Here
I
in
did.
Bear Branch.
I did, yes,
Yeah.
I did. Forgot about that. Yes, I forget that. I talk a lot, so I forget where I go to.
I have radio care.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Right here is the board member treasurer of the CRTF.
Awesome, thank you.
Dave Lambert, Charter Deputy Director of Emergency Management, Commissioner Cousins, Washington DC. I am currently serve for the American Legion and for the National Response Group. And I'm also at Department of State Security Corps structure consultant for emergency management response and for
You don't have very much going on then. Philippe, I know you well. Lastly,
My name is Michael. I'm a good friend of Philippe's. I come as a watcher and hopefully a liaison between local churches and ministries that need to grow up and find their place here.
excellent, thank you for sharing.
Hamburgers, the root on.
Okay. So, my name is Bradford Phillips. I'm a board certified master arborist. What that means is that, I know a lot about trees. And I know a lot about trees anywhere in North America and the various different problems that they have, and the various different situations that they cause. A board certified master arborist is somebody that has a credential at the very top of the International Society of Arboriculture. There's about 700 of us in the world. And I work specifically on complex tree situations. And part of that is I run a natural disaster response team that responds to all kinds of different natural disasters across the United States. I just got back from Hurricane Ian. I've been to every single wildfire in California over the last several years, earthquakes, tornadoes, all those kinds of things, ice storms. So I see a lot from the emergency management side. I do work hand in hand with various different fire departments, with FEMA and other state and governmental agencies involved with disaster response. So one of the things that I run into a lot when it comes to disaster response is communities that are disorganized and don't really know what to do and how to help. And Philippe would just give me a little bit of the background story about how this organization came together, which I think is brilliant. Because when I go to natural disasters, sometimes there's fatalities. Usually there are. Sometimes there's a lot of fatalities, and that goal itself really discombobulates the community, even above just the actual nature of the event. So the majority of the disasters I respond to are hurricanes. So in those situations, we're dealing with wind and we're dealing with water. Those two things do not mix well for trees, particularly considering that with climate change nowadays, our storms are getting wetter, hurricanes are getting wetter, and they're getting wetter in advance of the wind blowing. So trees are falling over in higher numbers of hurricanes now. So when I run into a storm, I used to run into them before the storm would pass. Go find at least a 4-story concrete parking garage, park inside of it, and let the storm run right over, and then go out and go assist. Some of the things that I used to do involved with this would be FEMA push contracts. So I'd clear the roads for fire and EMS and for other personnel to be able to get around the community and to be able to respond to calls. So in addition to that, what my company does now mostly is respond to private insurance claims. And of course, we do quite a bit of charity work as well when we're at these storms, and we do assist fire and EMS and police as necessary if we are in an area where we can assist them. Of course, oftentimes we're limited to how we can get around as well because of downed power lines, washed out bridges, and roads that are capitated. So when I'm at these disasters, I run into a lot of trees on homes, trees on cars, and what that may mean is, that may mean a tree on somebody's oxygen tank. That has happened before. Somebody who has a COPD that can't breathe, that has an oxygen tank that they can't get to. I've run into situations where a car is crushed and a dialysis patient that desperately needs their dialysis cannot get out and get to where they need to go. And on and on. Medications, pharmacies. If you're in a situation like Hurricane Ian or Hurricane Michael, you have to drive 2 hours at least to find a store that's open that maybe has your medication, and it may not even be the local pharmacy that's used, so they may not have access to it. So I help people understand and prepare for some of these disasters, certain situations, in certain parts of the country. And one of the things that I kind of try to tell people to do is, first of all, if you live here and you're a person that has homeowners insurance, understand your policy. And it's not very complicated to understand a policy. And it's very helpful to speak to other people who may not understand policies, particularly if you have family or friends who are elderly or are very young in their new first home, and they don't understand how it works. It goes on both ends of it. It's your middle-aged people that generally know what's going on. And people have various different kinds of private insurance. And depending on how close they live to the coast, it's going to be very, very different from somebody who lives further inland. People oftentimes get themselves in hot water when it comes to insurance. I'm going to hover on insurance for a moment because that's what I do a lot of right at the moment, and it's fresh and hot off the plate. So when you have a homeowner's insurance policy, for instance, you have coverage A, which is your home or dwelling. The only limitation on that for taking a tree off of it or otherwise or any other work is the value of rebuilding that home or the cost of rebuilding that home. Not the cost of your land or anything else, but the home. So you're pretty much good. If anything happens to that home, you're good to go. Coverage B is other structures. That's going to be your garage, detached carport, driveway, sidewalk. If it's yours, certain landscape features, irrigation, pipes, wires in the ground, that kind of thing, fences, and sheds and decks. So those on most all policies, you have a limitation on that, and it may be terrible. So if you want to be mindful of that, you may want to look at your policy in advance of that to see if you've made any improvements. If your home didn't have a fence and you built one, better update your policy. If you didn't have a deck and you built one, if you didn't have a lanai before and you built one, those kinds of things, you want to make sure that you have the coverage you need because you can get really hurt in a natural disaster. So do other people. So if you have friends or family, things like that, that may need assistance with understanding that, you may want to assist them. One thing that insurance companies like to do is to tell you you have coverage, and then on the last page on the exclusions is to tell you how much coverage you actually don't have. Case in point, I had my home broken into several years ago, and my firearms were stolen. Well, I had coverage C, personal property insurance. It's like $30,000. I thought, well, that'll take care of that. Well, there was a limitation on firearms, $500. Limitation on jewelry, $500. Limitation on appliances, $500. Limitation on toilet paper, probably $10,000. I don't know, because that's not going to get stolen. So you know, yeah. As they say in insurance school, you know, the insurance giveth on the declarations and taketh away on the exclusions. So that's really important to know. There's all kinds of other coverages you may or may not have on your policy. Now, let me tell you something. Your homeowner's insurance and your friends and family's homeowner's insurance, your community's homeowner's insurance doesn't cover trees. Now, you may have seen sometime before if you've had a tree related loss, you got some money for it, but let me explain that. Your homeowner's insurance covers your home, covers your structure, and it covers the repair of those things. If there's a tree on it, they pay to remove it so they can fix that part of it. They can fix the home, they can fix the shed, they can fix the whatever. You don't have insurance on your trees. Your tree is not insured in your yard. There are ways to value a tree, but insurance policies, unless you're a multimillionaire and you have AIG private client or something like that, that's a very exclusive policy, you don't have insurance on your trees. If you have any of the other big names, you just don't have it. They may throw you a nickel if it gets hit by lightning, you know, or they may give you some $250 because you lost a tree to something. That's even rare in and of itself. But what you have is you have insurance on your structures. If a tree hits it and it's still on it, and it's prohibiting the repair of it, they'll pay to remove it. Let me tell you something that happened in Hurricane Michael that a bunch of people like you sitting in this room did. And it was well-intentioned, and it happens at every storm I go to. There's a little old lady down the street, tree hits her house, and the neighbor comes over and trims all the branches off of the tree that landed on the roof so they can put a tarp on it, and her mind is now at ease. Now the tree is no longer touching the house. It may cost $10,000 to remove that tree that's this big around with a 200-ton crane because it's in the backyard and it has to be able to reach that far. She doesn't have insurance now. So while I was at Hurricane Michael, I had in Panama City and Panama Beach, there was a church, a local church, and they brought in 1,600 volunteers. It was a Mormon church, so they had a massive missionary network. And they did an astounding job of bringing in resources to the community. They brought in pipes, they brought in cooking trailers for like cook-offs, and they were brought in food, and they were feeding the community. Most of the people went around with tarps and saws and cut trees from houses, and they did exactly what I just described previously. And so what happened was there was an entire large area on the map you could draw a circle around where everybody lost their coverage. And it was unintentional. It was well-intentioned. Everybody meant well. And of course, you have a lot of people who just can't wait to use a chainsaw because they never get to use one. You know, they got it in the garage and they've been meaning to use it, you know. And the emergency rooms are full of those stories. And they usually involve a ladder, a chainsaw, and a guy that didn't listen to his wife. But you have, in this particular area, there was all kinds of mayhem because people could not get coverage on their homes. They couldn't get anything done regarding through their insurance. So even though they had no limitation on getting it off the home, now they did because there's nothing. And your insurance policy pretty much every single time will throw about $500 at you to haul debris to the curb. And that's it. And you can imagine tree service work is expensive when it's not a disaster. We have the highest rate of fatalities in any North American industry. We have the highest rate of injury of any North American industry. We have the highest cost for workers' comp. And we have the highest rate for general liability. So the costs are very high when you have tree work done. Now, when supply and demand kicks in and there's not anybody around and people come from out of state that have also incurred costs to mobilize, aside from the price gougings, I mean, just legitimate costs from moving across the country to come help, then it's extraordinarily expensive. And the good news is insurance is willing to pay those costs as long as it's on the house, as long as it's on the fence. So what I tell people is, if you want to help a situation, particularly where a tree is on structure, the best thing to do is to ensure that the resident is safe, that they have access to food, water, and shelter, that they have access to their medications, any doctor's appointments and medical needs that they have. And outside of that, if there's any communication efforts that can be assisted with the person, if they have any of those needs, you can assist with that communication, i.e. my communication guys, that can really help with people. One of the things we do when we go to storms, we bring a bunch of two-way radios that go about 2, 3, 4 miles. And they're fairly cheap and a bunch of batteries. And I can actually communicate with a client of mine or person I'm assisting from pretty far away once all the trees have been mowed down from the storm. So those are very helpful things that you can do. Now, if you're that person that is just itching to use that new Steel 046 in the garage with that new chain on it, go clear roads. Make sure fire and EMS can get through. Make sure that there's that all the emergency personnel and that people who need to get out, maybe up their driveway or down the road or across the sidewalk. We have a lot of ADA people in our communities. We have an aging community, particularly in this northeast side of Houston, where it's a young developmental area where people are aging. We have more senior homes than we've ever had in this area. And you don't want somebody in a wheelchair being forced to go down a flooded street because they can't get across the sidewalk. So those are important areas too to clear. All of that is stuff you can do regarding a chainsaw, regarding assisting people in those types of events. Now, one thing I'll touch on is in preempting the storm. Most of us that live in this area have trees. It's a heavily forested area. I'm from Kingwood, the livable forest. Tascasita is covered up in trees. Some trees fall over easier than others. I won't get into the specifics there unless you have questions. But one of the things I see people do a lot is they thin their trees out before a storm. They thin them out because that's going to let the wind travel through the tree better. And that means, under their assumption, that the tree is less likely to blow over. Well, that used to be true. Well, it was never true. We used to think that was true. For 40 years, our industry taught people that. And about 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, probably closer to 10 years ago, the data started coming out that was absolutely the opposite of what is true. So I'll tell you, for the management of your own properties, for your friends and neighbors, you don't want to do that. In the city of Houston, you have about 10,000 tree services that are paying for marketing online, Google, Yelp, and otherwise. There are 24 certified arborists in the city of Houston. That's it. Those are people that have the bare minimum qualification to understand the anatomy and physiology, biology of trees. Bare minimum. That's the bare minimum credential you can get, and there's only 24 of them. If you expand it to the greater city of Houston, you're closer to 40. Still, you're dealing with a number close to 10,000 services, companies that are offering that service. So the odds of you just going online and finding somebody that knows what they're talking about are extremely low. And so I will tell you, if you're working with, or you ever want somebody on this panel that knows what they're talking about, or you want to have work run into your home or your friends and family's home, what you want to look for, because arborist is not a protected title. Medical doctors are protected title. Arborist is not. So what you want an ISA certified arborist. That stands for the International Society of Arboriculture. ISA certified arborist, the ISA is 137 years old or more. And ISA certified arborist is somebody that will understand the baseline of trees. They will know, usually know not to thin out a tree. They will know how not to prune a tree. They will know how not to climb a tree, and they will know how to do it, all of that stuff, generally speaking, correctly. They won't be experts on tree healthcare. They won't be experts on everything. They will be an expert on one or two things involving trees, but they will have general knowledge of how to care for those trees. And that's really important. ISA certified arborist. There's a logo for that. It's a protected logo. And those credentials can be verified through the ISA's website. So if you have somebody coming out saying they are, you ask for their credentials and you go to the website and you look it up. That's very important. There are about 40 other certifications underneath the ISA, and the ultimate top one is the board certified master arborist. And in the city of Houston, there are 2 of us. I'm one of them. At Greater City of Houston, there are 4 of us. That is it. So if you have a tree that was hit by a car, struck by lightning, poisoned, vandalized, something like that, and you've got to save it, you've got to save it now, you need a board certified master arborist. And that will help you. Now, when it comes to pruning your trees, let me go back to the thinning. If you thin a tree out and you open it up, you completely change the way the tree's biomechanics work under wind load. When we're talking about the loads that are put on trees, we're talking about these engineering terms. I'm sure we have an engineer at least in here. But you're talking about tension, compression, torsion, and shear. So if I've got a tree, for those of us that are not engineers, and it's leaning this way, this is my tension side, because gravity crunching this side of the tree. This is my compression side. I'm sorry. This is my tension side, because the canopy of the tree over here is pulling on these fibers. So that's stretching. So you have big roots over here. You have deeper roots over here. Tension, compression. Torsion is the twisting action of a tree under wind load. When they're moving around, you notice that even if the wind's blowing straight, the tree still moves like this. Because as the force is being exerted on it, it's got multiple different angles of limbs coming out. Some of them catch the wind better, and then they move and they release that wind, and then this one moves and releases that. So you've got torsion on the trunk of the tree. And then shear is basically the opposing forces of a tree, this side of the tree moving one way, this side of the tree moving another way, and it shears off and splits up the middle. Okay, that's more common with your trees that are hollow or have some type of defect on the outside. When you thin a tree canopy and the wind moves through it, instead of having a dense crown where the entire tree can convert that load to the trunk, the thickest, strongest part of the tree, which then converts that down to the root system, which is where the majority of the biomass of the tree is. When you thin it out, you put all that force on the branches, the weakest part of the tree. So what happens is now, let's say I'm a tree, almost am one, and these are my limbs here going up. Well, gravity is pulling down on these limbs at a rate of 9.8 meters per second. So it's pulling, it's always pulling. Now let's say the wind's blowing this way. My limb's up here. I already have gravity pulling on it. Now I have a secondary force pushing on this limb as well, assisting gravity. What's going to happen? It's going to shear off and blow away. Now, do you want a 12-inch limb freely floating in the air when it's blowing 140 miles an hour? No, you don't. That's actually more dangerous than a tree falling down, because it can go halfway around the block and just go like a missile through a roof, through the side of a home, instead of actually hitting the top of the home like a tree would, which is where the home is actually built to experience load. So you don't want to thin out your trees. It will make your home, or it'll make you a higher risk of damage at your home and other people's homes. In addition to that, the tree, when it naturally moves and sways as a full canopy, is much more adapted, because when the wind blows through it now, it slows down the forces on the rest of the branches. Because your one side of the canopy is actually breaking the wind for the rest of the canopy. So don't let your trees get thinned down. Don't let them get lion-tailed, as we call it, which is when you have a tree trimmer go up in the tree and they strip out all what people call suckers. Strip out all that little stuff, and then the ends of the branches are like little poops. Don't do that. That's exactly the wrong thing to do. And you will likely regret it if the wind ever blows very fast. You raised your hand?
Yeah, I had this exact thing happen. See if how you want to weave this in. Hurricane, 15 years ago, the hurricane, tropical storm. Neighbor came and everybody was cutting their trees down. Pre-storm. And, we kept our tree. It was probably 80-footer or so, big canopy. And, in fact, a disaster was averted. What my neighbor wanted to do, because he was so concerned about it falling on his house, he wanted to take a wharf cable like for a tugboat and anchor my tree into the ground and just between the sidewalk and the street. Can you imagine if that had severed? Now, what happened is the tree did get knocked down, and unfortunately it fell and just caught the corner of my neighbor's house, which is what most people are trying to prevent, right? So it's too bad that happened, but I think you made a great point. That is, I didn't understand the physics, and I think most people don't.
Right. I mean,
And that projectile of that thing that was being used to anchor that wharf cable, I'm talking thick cable. Okay, that would have gone right through my front window. Could have killed somebody. So my question, and if you want to get to it later, is that when it fell, of course, my neighbor was not very happy with me because other people were cutting their trees down. But he claimed, and others claimed, there might be a good neighbor policy from my insurance company to cover the removal of that tree from his house.
because it was your tree.
Yes. He called it a good neighbor clause.
There's no such thing. The state of Texas and, to my knowledge, well, every state I've ever worked in, again, trees are not covered by insurance. Your structure is covered by your insurance. When it's an act of God situation, that's classified under the insurance company. It doesn't jack up your insurance rate. There's no problem with that. It just goes on your insurance. The only situation, that I know of that, would supersede that would be an act of negligence. These are cases that I get involved in as an expert witness when negligence is involved and there is an at-fault party. So you would have a situation perhaps where, let's reimagine your situation.
Well, if the opinion was I should have cut it, if the opinion was I should have cut it, I could have been negligent, correct?
Your tree, let's say your tree was sick. Let's say it was visibly sick enough for a common person to notice it.
Okay.
Doesn't require an expert. Let's say there's a big hollow spot on it, the leaves are turning brown, it's dropped a branch in the past and it fell on the fence. And your neighbor said to you, look, you gotta do something about this tree.
Right.
And let's say they did it in writing. And more than 90 days passed and you did nothing about it. That's generally the accepted period of time for the general standard of care of the tree or to avoid negligence. So let's say you didn't do any of that and the tree fell and it wasn't a hurricane. You may now be liable for 100% of the damages outside of the insurance policy.
I got you.
And
So
in
it
that
snapped,
situation, you
it
could be
snapped
liable.
about 3 foot high. There was evidence inside that there was degradation of life. But that tree was healthy for every other eyeball looking at it.
Speaking of that, before I get into this, I'll tell you, all trees get hollow. It's normal for trees to get hollow. It's not a structural defect for a tree to get hollow in most situations. Trees, the only living tissue on a tree is the skin of the tree, essentially, or the bark is really the skin and it's not alive. But if you were to drill into a tree trunk and you've got,
Hope this doesn't take you off.
a stump here, you've got your bark on the outside here. This is the rings of your stump, right? So, and your bark is on the outside. You've got bark you've got a cork layer where cork comes from. And then the next layer, I'm gonna blow it up for you. We're gonna call this the center of the tree. And this is the bark. Okay? If you were to drill a hole into the tree here, and you all the way to the center, and this would be the other side of the tree. What you would first come across is, and I'm going to draw this bigger than it is. What you would first come across when you get to the actual vascular tissue of the tree is a layer called the phloem. Then you're going to run into a layer called the cambium, very thin layer. Then you're going to run into a layer called the xylem. Okay, so that starts like this. That's phloem, cambium, xylem. Phloem mostly moves nutrients from the root, moves sugars from the leaves down to the roots to be stored as starch for winter. Cambium is the layer of stem cells that differentiates into phloem and xylem. The xylem moves nutrients, raw nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, boron, manganese, zinc, copper, all that, up to the leaves, okay? So in reverse, we say the inside here moves nutrients up, the phloem moves nutrients down. Xylem up, phloem down. That's how we remember it. Xylem up, phloem down. In between is a very tiny layer called the cambium. That's our stem cells again. Every single year, what makes these rings occur on your tree to where you can reliably know its age is that the cambium divides and it makes new layers of both. So the cambium layer is almost a layer of like 2 columns of cells. It's very thin. You're not going to see it with your eyes. What it does is it makes a new layer of phloem to the outside of the tree. It makes a new layer of xylem to the inside of itself. And so this cambium layer moves over. That's a ring. That makes the ring. Okay, so I'm cambium. I make a new layer here. I move over after I've made my new layer of phloem. Well, there was already an old layer of phloem there. It gets killed. It gets crushed and it dries out and it becomes bark. So if you ever walked up to a pine tree, which we have plenty of, and you peel the pine bark off, you've noticed it's in tiny little sheets, about 1/16 of an inch wide. Those are old layers of phloem. That's old vascular tissue. So that layer just dies, gets crushed, and disappears. Your xylem keeps a record because the cambium is always moving out to the outside. It makes a new layer of xylem every single spring. Okay, that's how you get your rings. That's the only part of the tree that's alive. The entire interior of your tree is just old rings. It's just old xylem. That's just old layers of xylem that are out of commission. It would be like when you have an old blacktop road, and you put a new layer on top. Then you put a new layer on top. Then you put a new layer on top, and then king of floods, right? And you put a new layer on top. You put a new layer on top. And you call Crenshaw's office. You say, why is this area flooded? So that's what it looks like. You look at now, you're not using those bottom layers anymore, right? That's not an active layer of road. That's an old layer of road. You're using the top layer. Once you wear it out, put on another. So that's what the tree does constantly. So if you were to walk up to an average oak tree, maybe 20 inches in diameter, and you were to drill a hole inside, you would go through the bark, which would all be really brown sawdust coming out. Then you're going to hit an area of tan, a light tan sawdust coming out until you go in about 1 inch deep. And then it's going to change colors again. And it may be, depending on the oak, it'll be red or it'll be dark brown again or something like that. That's all the dead part of the tree. It means nothing to the tree for that to rot away and hollow out. If you have carpenter ants in your tree, they're not a parasite. They're just eating that.
How about moisture?
Moisture is not a problem for trees inside the tree. There used to be all kinds of surgical procedures done on trees where water would collect in a pocket and people would drill a hole and put a drain in and all that. All that does is make it rot even more. Or it causes rot in an area that was compartmentalized by bark. And now you have a big cavity over time. There are a lot of outdated procedures that are still well in effect that have been preached against for 40 years plus. And they're still well in effect because, again, How many arborists do we have? 24. How many tree services do we have? 10,000. So bad practices have a much louder voice than good practices. So now that's not the same in every area, you know, California, you're required to have registration and all that kind of stuff. They're a little over the board with it. But you know, places like Virginia and Pennsylvania, places like that, they require this. If you want to work in the field. Baseline. I don't think it's much to ask. It helps prevent damage to people's most valuable landscape assets. By the way, your trees make up between 7 and 24% of your property value. So you screw up your trees, you're devaluing your most valuable asset, which is your property and home. And the reason why that number is so big is because if you're in Montrose and you live in a 3-story thing that's in this big and you've got a 4-foot diameter tree in your backyard that is as big as the estate I'm standing on, then yeah, that tree means a lot to the value of that, you know, $2 million home. If you live, you know, in Kingwood and you, like me, I've got 31 trees in my yard, that's not going to be 24% of the value of my property. It's going to be closer to that 7% then, right? Because there's some purpose to the property. Anyway, the inside of trees are dead. The outside is alive. The outside, about 1.5 inches is alive and actually doing stuff. The immune system is there. The stem cells are there. All the signals, the hormones are there. Trees have hormones just like we do. They have growth hormones and sex hormones. They have all of those things, just like we do. But yeah, you don't have to worry about the inside of a tree getting hollow unless you have it inspected by an arborist who also identifies some additional problem. For instance, if the inside of the tree is hollow and then you have a hollow spot up top somewhere near a big limb, then that big limb may be in jeopardy of breaking, something like that. But the hollowness of it is not a problem. If you have a steel rod and you drive over it, it's still a steel rod. If you have a steel pipe and you drive over it, it's still a steel pipe. It's not going to bend on you if it's a steel pipe. It's hollow, but the forces still travel around. So that's how you think about it. There are various different flaws in trees, and there are different things you may need to prune out or that you may need to deal with. And what you don't want to do is what we talked about, lion tailing, which is when somebody goes up to your tree and takes all this off, takes off all the interior stuff. And then you have a naked tree, which actually kind of looks nice to most of us because then you can kind of see your branch structure and all those lights maybe you have in the yard show off the branch structure and it's kind of pretty, but it won't be pretty when they start breaking. And it's an if, not a when. There are certain things in trees that do need to be dealt with. There are certain, what we call suckers. The ones that you need to take out are called epiformic sprouts. Those are the ones that come off the trunk, make a hard bend and go straight up parallel to the trunk. Probably seen those before. You're more likely to have those if you've had your tree stripped out. Okay. That is something that should be deleted off the tree and removed because it's a acute angle at the trunk means that the bark of the branch and the bark of the tree are going to get pinched in the middle there. And so they don't actually grow together. They just start pushing against each other. And eventually that limb will fail when it's larger and heavier. So you want to take off something like that. Trees always grow toward the ground. Every tree is going to grow toward the ground. It shades the root system. It helps preserve moisture. It helps prevent grasses and competing plants from growing. And it's perfectly fine to have a tree grow toward the ground. Some of the most majestic trees you ever see are in pictures on people's walls, big live oaks reaching down to the ground and then loping along the ground and things like that. It's really pretty. You may not be able to do that in your yard. You may have a stop sign in play, right? You may have a driveway, sidewalk. It depends on how big your yard is and your property is. So you may have to trim it up so that you can mow around it or deal with your flower beds. That's fine. Just understand that when you take these out, the sun in the sky is now going to be able to hit the trunk, the soil, the root flare of the tree. And so it's going to face some additional heat stress than what it would have if those branches weren't lifted. And that's fine. You can mitigate that with mulch around the tree. We don't pile mulch up on trees like that. We just do a thin 3-inch layer around the tree, ideally out to the edge of the drip line where the branches are at. That's where you want to be at. That's not possible in most situations in subdivisions because that would be your whole yard. You have very few trees. And some people do that. We've seen yards before, you drive past, the whole place is landscaped out to the curb, right? Trees love that. So there are certain defects like that. Another defect in a tree is what we call codominancy, which is when a tree has two trunks at some portion of the tree. It could originate from the ground, could originate at any point of the tree. So you have a tree with two trunks like that. It's an acute angle. So it's a V, it's not a sweeping U, right? If it's a sweeping U, that's strong. Because what will happen is the bark on this side and the bark on that side will be pushed up into a ridge there and it'll slough off over time. In this situation, the bark gets pinched in here. So as this limb and this limb get wider, you're gonna have all this included bark in here. And almost every time that you see a tree that splits in half like that, i.e. Bradford pears especially, they love to do that. You can walk right up to it. You can see all the way down the middle of the split. It's got bark all the way on the inside. It was never actually grown together. Even if it had bark over the surface of it, it never grew together. That's a structural flaw. Sometimes people put cables in the trees to hold them together. If you put a cable in a tree, it will always need a cable in a tree because it will never be able to not have one. Because other fibers will grow weaker and they'll always depend on it. Kind of like if you put a cast on your arm and you just leave it on there, you'll have a very skinny anemic arm before you know it. I'm gonna pause here for a moment. I know I'm going fast and I talk fast and cover a lot of ground. So if any of you have any questions, now's a good moment.
I have a beautiful oak tree in my backyard. It's probably, I don't know, 20 inches in diameter. But my backyard over the years, the ground has grown and I need to have that reshaped.
Your ground has grown. Did I hear that right?
Yeah. So,
By that,
no, it's now 10 inches higher than it should be.
you've added soil.
No, I have not added. So it's just, I think it's from 30-something years of the landscape or the mower guy just mowing the yard and letting the stuff lay there and it's just,
It's around the tree though.
no, it's a whole yard. So I've got to have that all reshaped so it'll drain properly, but I don't want to harm my tree.
So, I don't know that it happened I don't know why it happened. That the ground would be higher than it used to be, or what you're basing that on, or what indicators you have or that happened. Because organic matter going to the ground from clippings dissolves in humus, which becomes a soil particle that drifts down and is decomposed and utilized by microbes. But it just disappears, basically. Or it's converted to CO2, it just leaves. So adding organic matter, just like when you add mulch into your flower beds and a year later it's just gone. And it doesn't raise the layer of the flower bed unless it's not gone and keep adding to it, because that just decomposes or gases off. But let's take the situation where you need to regrade. Let's just say regrading is necessary for drainage, or something is necessary for drainage, right? Let me give you a situation that's common. I've got a fence line here. This is homeowner A, this is homeowner B. Homeowner B is a jerk and raised their soil line up here. Homeowner A's soil line is down here. Right? Because homeowner B said, well, my property's not draining, so I'm gonna add fill here and screw this guy. Happens all the time. It's in violation of EPA 404, by the way. You get sued for that big time. So let's say homeowner A now has a drainage problem where, their yard originally sloped toward the fence like that. And it's up higher over here. And this yard originally did that as well. And then the water would run down the fence line and out of the community like it oftentimes does in the woodlands or something like that. All right. So now homeowner A has their lovely little home here. And they've got their lovely tree here. And now when it rains, the water runs over here. Right, so the tree is now sitting in water. Now it has phytophthora root rot, fusarium, some other root rot disease rotting in the water. maybe other diseases. But really common in our area is that we have sandy loam soil at the top. Sandy loam, which is great soil. It dries out quick, so you keep mulch on top of it, but it's great soil. You can grow anything in it. But then underneath it somewhere, there's a clay pan. Right? And of course, this person, when they elevate it, they just use cheap construction fill. So they still have that sandy loam layer here. Now they got clay on top of it. And clay below it. Whoops. So they have what's called perched water table. So all this is all aquatic. All water descending on those water. It's gonna suck for them is that all this is gonna change because they put clay on top of sand. For you over here, all this is wet. This water just doesn't move down through this clay. It moves very, very slowly through it, but not really. So you're depending on transpiration for that to dry out. Now, what most people do is they say, well, screw this guy. I'm gonna put in more clay, right? And they kill their tree. If you put more than 3 inches of soil if you put 3 inches or more, and I would argue 2 inches, maybe even an inch and a half, depending if you use equipment, on top of a tree's root system, it dies. It'll die. It can't breathe. The root system depends on microbes, which depend on a constant supply of fresh oxygen. So when rain comes down, and then the rain drains out, it draws oxygen back into the soil, right? So microbes won't survive in a soil that doesn't have oxygen. They eutrophy, they release carbon dioxide, floods the soil and kills the tree. And the tree can't breathe otherwise. The right thing to do in this situation is a couple of things depending on where your soil corrects itself. If it goes out to the street here, it drains back down. You've got a road here coming through your neighborhood. You could potentially cut a narrow ditch or a French drain.
Right.
So you have a catch basin here, and then you have your drain pipe running through the root system out to the street. This must be hand dug or dug with air. Arborists use something called an air spade. It uses those air compressors. You see that use the jackhammers on the roadsides when they're doing highway construction, big lot of diesel ones. And an arborist uses what's called an air spade or an air knife, and it shoots air at Mach 2. And it will not hurt a root or a pipe or a wire, but it will fracture anything porous like soil. It'll break the soil. You can dig a trench with that. You can run your pipes right underneath the root system, backfill your trench in, no harm to the tree, and your water moves out. That's one option. The other option is that there's not a road over here and it just goes up. And then maybe there's a ditch out here somewhere, but you got to move water uphill somehow. I've done these many times. It's an expense, but it's a very good one. And you just put in a sub pump here. Put in your sub pump right in here. Make it interesting. Make it a dry river bed. Make it a landscape feature. It'll look really nice. Shoot it out to the curb with a 2-inch pipe. Same thing with the landscape piping. Instead of some landscape piping, I'm using a 2.5-inch pipe. Shoot it out to the curb. Regrading is a bad option around trees because the tree, 90% of the tree's absorbing fibers are in the top 6 to 8 inches of soil. So we think people say it all the time, and it's somewhat true. If you, as much tree as you see above ground, there's that much below ground. For argument's sake, let's say that's true, and it's kind of true. Depends on the species, depends on the soil, depends on a lot of things. But let's just say it's true. This is how tree roots grow, and I want to talk about this for a second because this has a lot to do with uprooting and storms and natural disasters. Let's say this is your soil. We have our lovely tree here. What's going to happen is you have buttress roots here. This is the buttress flare, the root collar. Those grow down to about, let's say it's a live oak or some oak, goes down to about 3 to 4 feet, curves up to about 18 inches deep. That root goes down 3 or 4 feet, goes back up to about 18 inches deep, and then it sends its feeder roots back up to the surface. Okay, and then it has sinker roots that drill down like this. They don't really absorb water, they're for structure. So they guys grow up here. So in the top Where the roots really differentiate into fine fibers here, this is where the majority of your small root mass is, okay? So in the top 6 to 8 inches of soil is where 90% of your nutrients are taken up by the tree. 6 to 8 inches. That's where we do deep root fertilization. Deep root, sometimes we think it means it's really, really deep, but it's not. It's 6 to 8 inches deep. We're just trying to get it below the grass roots, which are about 2 inches deep. So this area is where nutrients are put in when a tree is fertilized, because that's where 90% of the absorbing nutrients are. And the buttress root transforms into this linear root, which is there for structure. If you ever seen a tree pulled up, you may have seen this root before. And there are other buttress roots that go down like this. And the exception to that rule is a pine tree, which has all this too. Pine trees absorb all their nutrients in the top 6 to 8 inches of soil, but they also have a taproot and some lateral roots that come off that taproot. And a pine tree doesn't have a taproot that goes as high, that deep as it is tall. A pine tree has a taproot that grows down until the oxygen level, O2, is less than 5%. So in clay soil, you're going to run out of oxygen real fast. So you won't see much root. In sandy soil, the root can grow much deeper. But typically sandy soil is sandy until it's clay, because we're in kind of a coastal area, right? Technically, we're in a coastal delta where it meets East Texas. We're just right on that line. So that's the way in which the tree root system grows, and that's why we feed up at the top. And if you can imagine, like that other example with the custard red clay soil, let's say we've got sandy loam to clay. So we've got sandy loam, we've got clay. These guys oftentimes won't grow into that unless it's something that can really deal with it. Okay, or they won't grow as deep, so they just grow a little shallower. Unless it's a cypress tree or something like that. Yes, sir.
You show roots running along the top of the ground. What is that doing and why is it like that?
Yes, sir. So let me talk about that. So let me show you why that happens. Because it's a question I have every day. I was going to be here about 10 minutes earlier, but I was answering that question on the phone. One of my guys in the field was asking me about it, and had a lady in the background. There's a system that we grind these roots out on this tree. Let me show you a typical Houston subdivision situation where this occurs. And of course, there's many exceptions to this, but this is what you see in almost every home in Atascocita and Kingwood. All right, got your home, got your yard, you got your front door, and it's here. And your yard slopes down to the curb. You've got a road, there's a curb, there's another yard that slopes up that way, right? You got these gutters here and the drain pipes, whatever. Here somewhere in the front yard, you've got a sidewalk, and on the other side, on either side of that sidewalk, you've got a light. Right? Now, it could be any tree, but typically it's going to be a live one. Now, remember the tension and compression thing I was telling you about? We were talking, this tree right here is on a slope, right? It thinks if you could rotate this upward that it's falling that way. So this is the tension side of the tree, and this is the compression side of the tree. The tension side always puts out a bigger root. And those roots are going to stay closer to the surface to hold that tree in. So you're going to have roots on the uphill side of most trees. They're going to be close to the surface. You'll have some down here too. Now, very quickly, because I know I have to stop. When you have a tree that is a live oak in particular, or any other tree, the roots, the surface roots, are feeder roots that got big. Those are feeder roots that were really small. They were as small as a human hair, and they got big. Now, when you look at soil structure, you look at layers. Let's say you dug 8 feet deep. You're going to have layer O, A, B, C, all the way on down until you get to bedrock. We don't have bedrock here because we're too close to the ocean. Layer O is organic matter. This is leaves and twigs. Leaves, twigs, animal droppings, earthworms, rats' nests, things like that in nature. A is your actual first soil level that has a relatively high carbon content. That's the dark soil, right? So if you dig in your flower beds, the soil underneath there is dark and black. If you dig out in your St. Augustine, it's pretty clay and some sand, right? This one has a halfway decent carbon level. This one has almost no carbon left in it. This is where the majority of your carbon is, almost all carbon. Your live oak trees and all your other trees that grow naturally in forests that are not savanna trees like post oaks, but your live oak trees, they have their trunks here. And they have their, to get to your illustration of my illustration previously about those lateral roots that run down about 18 inches. Why do they run 18 inches? Because that's layer A, it's solid mineral soil. And all the feeder roots come up into where the carbon is. The carbon, the leaves, the twigs, the animal droppings, that's all nutrients. So these are up here, right? Now, this is in the forest setting. Now, let's say you don't have a mulch bed around your trees. And this is why you're seeing roots. You don't have a mulch bed there. It's out in the grass, right? That's because your grass doesn't have a carbon layer. It doesn't have an organic layer. So all these roots that come up, what do? They just run along the surface. They're just pretending that they're in this imaginary O layer that's not there. So can you bury it with soil? No. Can you bury it with mulch or compost? Yes, because that's organic.
Yeah, I have one last question I want to ask. It's about wildfires and firestorms as a consequence of hurricane recovery, especially for this area here in Kingwood. This is a heavily wooded area, and one of our primary evacuation routes is Kingwood Drive. And there's a traffic island right down the middle of Kingwood Drive, and there's underbrush under those trees that's 12 to 18 feet high.
Yes, sir.
I've also talked to people in Australia about how they've dealt with the excessive wildfires that they've had. And the areas that were operated and controlled by the Aborigines, where they did backburns and burned out the underbrush, had no wildfires. The areas that were left overgrown, like we have here, had massive wildfires. And considering that that's one of our primary evacuation routes, and considering our worst case scenario now is Puerto Rico that had 155-mile-an-hour winds for 12 consecutive hours, they had 30 to 50% tree failure. If we have 1 out of every 3 trees come down here, that's going to be a debris pile that's 12 to 15 feet high. And within 30 to 60 days, that's going to be the biggest pile of kindling in North America. And we have the potential of having a Bastrop fire superposed over North Houston.
There's a lot I could unpack there. What I'll tell you is that fire season is before and during hurricane season. After hurricane season, we don't really have fire season, but we can, but it doesn't generally happen. The fires that occur that I have seen across North America and responded to have nothing to do with hurricanes or debris pile up. They had to do with poor forestry management in wildland areas. Not necessarily so much in subdivisions, but wildland areas that spread into subdivisions. Most of it is brought on by the expansion of the Hadley cell because of the carbon in the atmosphere and poor forestry management.
But shouldn't that underbrush be removed?
Probably not in the case of Kingwood Drive, because there's a concrete road there and a lot of houses, a lot of fire hydrants. The likelihood of a wildfire is pretty low in our area. But yes, underbrushing is pretty common for management and forestry, and the ladder fuels in particular, meaning the geopond. But they try to talk to KSA about it and they'll just ignore you. But
And when those trees come down, how are our people going to get out?
well, the same way they did in Hurricane Ike, volunteers get together and cut them out of the way.
During Katrina, there was a situation where there was a town outside of New Orleans, about 20 miles outside the town. It was a retirement area for people who had built around a fishing lake. 100 men accumulated to get into that area to rescue their relatives. It was a 20-mile dirt road or asphalt road. 100 men working night and day with chainsaws to move the debris so they could move forward. Took 3 days to go 20 miles.
Yes, and that's why you don't have Mayor Ray Nagin.
I hate to be rude and interrupt, but you know, I don't know respectful people that need it.
I have
We need to, leave.
So I have my information up there. That's my phone number on my website. If you want to contact me there with any further questions, I could talk to you after.
And the question is, every night at 6:30, if I'm watching TV, I see this Chevrolet ad about a Chevrolet truck pulling over a tree. Have you seen that one? And they show the roots and everything, it pulled it out of the ground. Can those trees be replanted and will they live?
No, trees that fall over usually can't be replanted unless they're tropical trees.
All right, well, Brad, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Are we all done? Good deal. Great. Thanks. Great, Cameron. How long have you been with the Dan Crenshaw's office?
About 2.5 years.
Okay.
Really? Yeah. Well, that's not properly.
Yeah, I graduated from college. That is bad.
All right.
It's like, I would have thought a year.
Right. Hey, nobody's here at public safety. All right, thanks. Yes.
Yes.
I'm Larry Lake. Hey, you Cameron.